Good afternoon. My name is Krista Martel, and I'm pleased to be presenting today on behalf of our co-authors listed here. I will be presenting Breastfeeding and HIV in the U.S. and Canada, centering women's lived experiences into the clinical, research, and policy discussion. In many parts of the world that fall under the World Health Organization's guidelines, breastfeeding is the standard of care for parents living with HIV. Within low-resource settings, breastfeeding promotes overall survival and well-being of HIV-exposed infants. While the research is limited, it demonstrates that there is an extremely low risk of HIV transmission when the breastfeeding parent has sustained viral suppression. In the U.S., Canada, and other high-resource settings, guidelines recommend not breastfeeding among women living with HIV. Research in these settings is very limited, especially as it pertains to viral suppression in breastfeeding. While the current guidelines in the U.S. and Canada do provide information for providers on how to support women who choose to breastfeed, the limited awareness and clinical standards has created challenges for their supporting women with the HIV in their decision-making around infant feeding. With the increased awareness of U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable for sexual transmission, stakeholders across the HIV community are requesting more clarity around infant feeding and guidance to both the risks and benefits of breastfeeding while virologically suppressed. Factors that do not come into account under the current guidelines are both the potential health benefits to mother and child related to breastfeeding or potential health risks to mother and child of not breastfeeding. While the limited research we do have does not show zero risk of transmission, although it is less than 1% with sustained virologic suppression, elimination of any risk of HIV transmission is often the only factor considered during the infant feeding decision-making process. This approach may not consider challenges related to health disparities and family, cultural, and economic values. Most importantly, this approach is at odds with the autonomy of parents living with HIV and their fundamental right to make informed choices about their children's care. Last fall, the WELL Project and the International Community of Women Living with HIV North America, also known as ICWNA, partnered to develop a North American working group on breastfeeding and HIV. Both the WELL Project and ICWNA are nonprofit organizations focused on improving the health and well-being of women living with HIV through education, community support, advocacy and leadership development, collaboration, and advancing research for and with women living with HIV. In October 2020, the WELL Project and ICWNA convened a multidisciplinary, multisectoral group of 23 U.S. and Canadian experts across the field of HIV, among them a diverse group of women living with HIV with a range of breastfeeding experiences. 21 of these participating experts took part in a pre-meeting survey assessing perceived infant feeding priorities for women living with HIV and the biggest challenges to achieving them, providing the main focus for our convening. The convening resulted in the development and dissemination of the Expert Consensus Statement on Breastfeeding and HIV in the United States and Canada. Some of the top priorities identified included the need for additional research in this area, increased and improved education for healthcare providers, as well as increased and improved education for women living with HIV. The top challenges identified included the disregard for the bodily autonomy and decision-making ability of people living with HIV, parents and partners, inadequate resources for providers to help support infant feeding decisions of the women they see, a lack of understanding for many providers around existing research, as well as the criminalization of pregnant and birthing parents. I'd like to take a moment to read through some of the quotes from our experts to help contextualize some of these issues. I am a woman living with HIV and mother, and I believe that women living with HIV should have access to all of the information around breastfeeding as well as self-determination and choice. Because it represents one of the current frontiers of HIV stigma panic/moral panic, it is a salient example of how compounded biases affect healthcare practice with great potential harms for long-term health inequity, and is a key example of why we must eliminate the maternal-fetal conflict framing of perinatal care and ethics, as it incorrectly assumes that we, healthcare providers, take infants' best interests to heart more than their own mothers. I didn't even know there were any benefits for a mom to breastfeed, or that we could negatively be affected if we do not breastfeed. That wasn't even posed to me. The decision was given to me that I was not able to breastfeed. The key points of the consensus statement calls for stakeholders to recognize, account for, and advocate to change intersectional conditions. Understand and respect the fundamental right of women and other birthing parents to make informed, uncoerced choices about their care and the care of their children. Develop provider education and tools to address the complex realities facing parents living with HIV in their infant feeding decisions. Create parent resources and support peer-to-peer systems to provide parents living with HIV with comprehensive education and support around infant feeding. Engage in policy reform to ensure guidelines reflect women's rights, agency, and best practices, and address criminalization of people with HIV, including those who breastfeed. Advance research to understand existing data on HIV and infant feeding, identify and address remaining knowledge gaps. As mentioned earlier, the co-authors of the consensus statement include a multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary group of experts specializing in HIV from the US and Canada, including infectious disease doctors, pediatricians, OBGYNs, midwives, women living with HIV, social scientists, sexual and reproductive justice advocates, and legal experts. To provide additional context to the consensus statement in this topic, there are several appendices that can be found attached to the statement, which can be also found on our website at thewellproject.org. So there's additional context around infant feeding among parents living with HIV, more information from our pre-meeting survey, the recommendations for actions moving forward, both short and long term, additional women and HIV infant feeding resources, which is in a Google Doc and is a living document, so we can be adding to it as we identify more resources, as well as the references of the works consulted. In order to center women and other birthing parents living with HIV, we need to shift the paradigm to recognize their autonomy and build upon a trust that they will make the best decisions for themselves and their families when equipped with resources and support. We need to include them at every level of program, research, and policy development and implementation. It's also important to acknowledge this work exists in a context of structural racism, colonization, assimilation, anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenous, gender bias, and economic injustice. So in terms of next steps, the goal is to continue to develop additional programming and push research and policy agendas as identified by the working group. We also invite individual and organizational stakeholders working in HIV and related communities to read and sign on to the consensus statement. So far to date, we have over 40 organizational endorsements and 100 individual endorsements and growing. The sign-on statement also provides endorsers with the opportunity to join a listserv on this topic and express interest to join future working group convenings. Additionally, people can email Olivia Ford at the Well Project to join this HIV infant feeding listserv to stay updated and share ongoing work and resources. And our partners at ICWNA recently launched Milky Mamas, a virtual support community by and for women living with HIV who have breastfed or desire to learn more. I've included my contact info for the Well Project, and I would just like to acknowledge the co-authors of this abstract, the members of the North American Working Group on Breastfeeding and HIV, the co-authors of the consensus statement, as well as its endorsers, and all the women, parents, and partners who have had to navigate the challenges of infant feeding decision-making without support. Thank you very much.